Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to everyone for being here. I also am deeply honored to be part of this network and be on a panel with people I so admire. That's a lot I was asked to cover in a very short period of time. I don't know if I'm going to get to all of it, but I will really try. So, today is the 76th anniversary of the adoption of the Genocide Convention, and tomorrow marks International Human Rights Day. International Human Rights Day marks the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and that enshrines the inalienable rights that every person is entitled to as a human being, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, language, or any other status. Article 1 of the Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is one sentence. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's it. And yet here we are, 76 years after the adoption of these landmark conventions, the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we are 14 months into a live stream genocide that we have not been able to stop. And we have not been able to achieve the simple principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. In fact, the Amnesty International report that Asal alluded to or mentioned, that the title of it is "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman." And that's what Palestinians have been feeling like. And not only Palestinians, right? It's the majority of the global South, that they are not equal, or their lives are not valued as much as Western European American lives. And certainly they have a good reason to think that. But where are we going? We should be working towards a world where everybody is valued as being equal. Looking at the legal landscape of over this past year, we have seen a lot of movement on the legal level. And I'll briefly go over those. So it's not for lack of legal action that we have not been able to stop this genocide. It's the problem is the failure of the international community of states to comply with the rulings and to live up to their legal obligations under international law. And that was also alluded to in the questions in terms of, the UN system and where we are with that. But that is one of the main problems of international law. And that question has been asked a lot over the last year specifically, but even way back when I was teaching law in Jerusalem to Palestinian students who would look at me and say, this looks good, but it doesn't apply to us, because going back to whose lives are valued and whose lives are not, and how does the law apply and to who. So there's no enforcement mechanism in international law. That comes back to states and state politics. And so we live in a world where there actually is what the United States refers to a lot as the rules-based order. And a rules-based order is not what we should be striving for, because a rules-based order is an order where the powerful make the rules. It is defined by what the United States and its Western allies consider to be the rules. And of course, they bend it to serve their interest. What we want is the application of international law. So we want an international legal order, a law-based order where the law applies equally to everyone. But to go back, so there have been a lot of movement on the legal level. And to cover those briefly, we had recently, just a couple of months ago, an International Court of Justice advisory opinion that came out in July of this year. And just to make clear, when we say that it's an advisory opinion, it is not that it is any less meaningful in terms of the applicability of the law. People say, oh, it's advisory, it's not binding. All that is meant by it's an advisory opinion is it didn't come as a result of a contention between two states, because the International Court of Justice hears disputes between states and then it renders a decision. In this case, it's not a dispute between states. The UN General Assembly posed some questions to the International Court of Justice, and they studied them and issued an opinion that lays out what the law says. So this is the state of the law. And what this opinion made clear is that Israel is not only occupying Palestinian territory, because it is long disputed that this territory is occupied, but also that this occupation is illegal. Because under international law, occupation is actually not illegal. But this, because of what Israel has been doing over the last 56 years to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, the the occupation has become illegal. They didn't use the word colonizing, but in fact, that's what they have said in terms of establishing settlements and stealing um, resources. And what it also said is that Israel's actions violate Article 3 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Segregation, which is apartheid. So uh, we have a decision by the World Court that Israel is instituting a system of racial segregation and apartheid. It is illegally occupying Palestinian territory. It must dismantle its occupation, all settlements without exception, as quickly as possible. It must pay reparations also and establish a system by which Palestinians are given reparations. And one of the most important things that should be self-evident, but it made clear, is that Israel is violating the Palestinian right to self-determination. And the Palestinian right to self-determination is a right that's not contingent upon a peace process. It is not subject to any conditions that the occupiers put on it. Palestinians have been uh, due their self-determination, and Israel is currently preventing it, and they are entitled to receive it immediately. And therefore they put to bed this notion that Palestinians have to negotiate for their basic rights, which is what we always hear by Western countries and from the United States specifically, is that Palestinian freedom is contingent upon a peace process. And we have been beholden to this peace process for decades that has only allowed Israel to entrench its occupation. One last thing about that opinion, which is really important, is that it went back and put an obligation on all states and the United Nations and international institutions that they have an obligation to do everything in their power to bring about the end to this illegal occupation as soon as possible. And that includes an obligation not to recognize the illegal situation that Israel has created, not to recognize any settlements, not to do business with settlements, and also to use other mechanisms at its disposal to pressure Israel to end its illegal occupation. So that comes back to, as activists, as people who are working, like, how can we use that to pressure our institutions, our states, our even local bodies to institute boycott, divestment, sanctions, etc., to help pressure Israel to bring its occupation to an end. Then we all, I think, know about South Africa versus Israel, and that is a contentious case before the International Court of Justice. This is South Africa that brought Israel before the International Court of Justice to say Israel is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention. And that court found, of course, we won't have a decision for a while because these things unfortunately take a while. So we don't have a pronouncement from the court as to whether Israel's guilty of violating the Genocide Convention, but the court did issue preliminary measures, and that came as a result of a finding that there was a real and imminent risk of prejudice to the rights of the Palestinians not to be subject to acts of genocide. So it found, because the case is going forward, it found that it is plausible that Israel is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention. So it's plausible that Israel is committing a genocide, and there's a real and imminent risk of prejudice to the rights of the Palestinian people not to be subject to a genocide. And therefore, it issued these preliminary measures, actually 3 sets of preliminary measures that provided that humanitarian aid needs to get into Gaza ASAP, unrestricted, that fact-finding missions should be allowed in, and Israel must not do anything to hinder the documentation of what is actually happening in Gaza. And Israel also has an obligation to ensure that Palestinians are not subject to acts of genocide, which really would mean Israel needs to stop attacking Gaza, because it has created a situation where it is nearly impossible to live. Of course, it committed all kinds of harms, killing, mental harm, etc. So that's the South Africa v. Israel. that is ongoing. We have a case that's not looked at as much, but Nicaragua brought Germany also before the International Court of Justice to say that Germany is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention by continuing to supply Israel with weapons by which to commit a genocide. And that case is proceeding, it's going forward. But in that case, Nicaragua also asked for preliminary measures, which the court did not grant. The court didn't grant preliminary measures, not because it found that there isn't a violation here, but Germany argued that they have drastically reduced their weapons sales to Israel, and what contracts they have left, like the little that they have left, is not actually being used to commit the genocide. So that was Germany's argument, and the court tended to agree with that. So while they didn't issue these preliminary measures, they did make some clear pronouncements that are really important, and I just want to mention them briefly. They reiterated that third states have an obligation to ensure that the Genocide Convention and um, or that states aren't committing genocide, and they have a obligation to ensure that the Geneva Conventions are upheld. So even if these states are not part of a conflict, they still, as third states, have obligations to ensure that the Geneva Conventions are upheld and that the Genocide Convention is not being violated. So that means that they have an obligation to not aid the perpetrator in committing these violations and these acts, which obviously means don't supply them with weapons or any other kind of aid that could help them in violating these conventions. And lastly, we have, as I think everyone knows, the ICC arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. We'll see what is to come of those. Of course, there are 124 states that are part of the International Criminal Court and that are actually under obligation to turn over these two if they come within their jurisdiction. A number of European states have already said that they will uphold their obligations as members of the as signatories to the Rome Statute. We've had some countries shamefully wavering, but they are under this obligation, and certainly this will be a test of whether what is the future of the International Criminal Court? What is the future in terms of all of these cases? What is the future of the international legal order? Because we see the United States being the biggest perpetrators of trying to undermine all of these. The ICC, we might see the Trump administration certainly sanction the ICC, and the United States also trying to undermine the decisions of the International Court of Justice. We have, but I won't get into them, also litigation that can take place.
We're running a little over, Hawaida, so could we wrap up and go to some questions?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, I'll stop there. But just to say that is litigation in domestic courts. There was in the United States and in other courts that can also attempt to hold these perpetrators accountable. And I expect to see more on that front. And we've already had the Netherlands, for example, found that the Netherlands must stop weapons transfers to Israel. There's a case in the UK also on the same basis. But let me stop there.